Welcome, everyone, to the first in a series from the Jewish Museum of Maryland and Hizikamuna Congregation with support from our colleagues at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture. I am Tracy Guy Decker, Deputy Director at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I'm delighted that there are so many of you joining us this afternoon. As we get started, I'm going to ask you to please be patient with any technical glitches that might occur this evening. If you do have technical issues, please click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen and you can send a message just out to the world and someone from our tech team will attempt to assist you, or you can direct chat to either of the Jewish Museum of Maryland profiles. If you have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature also at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer all of your questions following the presentation. For those of you joining us on Facebook, please submit your questions in the comment field and someone from our tech team will pass them along to us here in the Zoom room. Next, when our presentation ends, or if you need to leave early, simply hit the leave button at the bottom of your screen to exit. At that time, you'll be immediately directed to a survey about your experience. If you can please take a couple of minutes to share your thoughts, it will help us learn from this program and to take those lessons from you into our future work. And with that little bit of housekeeping taken care of, I am delighted to turn it over to Abe Kronsberg, who will tell us a little bit more about what we can expect this afternoon. Abe?
Thanks, Tracy. I'm Abe Kronsberg. I'm a member of Hizikamuna Congregation, and I serve on the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. Welcome to our series. Why this series? Why now? I can only tell you what motivated me. While the death of George Floyd was a shock, I had seen similar instances of racism and violence in the past. This time, however, I determined to take some responsibility, to do something. I concluded that while I might not be able to affect society at large, I could help my Jewish community put its house in order, particularly for Ella, my multiracial granddaughter. Of small acts are large projects born. While the four persons who planned this series didn't agree on everything, we did strive to create a series that stressed four elements, many of which echo the thoughts of some of our participants. First, the importance of diversity and inclusiveness in the Jewish community. Second, the importance of standing in solidarity with portions of the Jewish community that are under duress from racism. Third, recognition of the need to provide opportunities for portions of the Jewish community that have not received the attention they deserve. And fourth, the importance of creating a series that addresses not only national issues, but also local ones, and that gives the subject matter an in-depth examination, not a cursory one. These are some of the questions for which this series will seek answers. Who and how many are Jews of color? How do racial concepts affect our views of Jews? Who counts Jews and which Jews count? Can lost identities be recovered? What happens when a marginalized group marginalizes its own group members? How do we raise anti-racist children? Who gains when anti-Semitism is used to divide Jews from their allies? What greater opportunities would Jews of color suggest that the wider Jewish community provide? We've spent months planning for this event, and I want to spend just a few moments thanking some of the institutions and people who made it possible. First, I want to recognize three institutional partners: Hizikamuna Congregation, the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, all of which recognize the importance of this topic and furnished resources to make it happen. Second, I would like to recognize the three persons who were my collaborators and the visionaries behind the series. Andy Miller, the chairman of Hizikamuna's Social Justice Advocacy Committee. Dr. Harriet Wims, a passionate voice for Jews of color. And Tracy Guy Decker, the Deputy Director of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. Third, I want to recognize those who did the heavy lifting while some of us would-be visionaries dreamed. From the Jewish Museum of Maryland, Trillian Atwood, Rachel Kasman, and Laura Grant, and from Hisacamona Congregation, Rabbi Josh Gruenberg, Rabbi Debbie Wexler, and Melissa Halpert. Lastly, I want to recognize my wife, Robin, who listened to my endless thoughts about this series, who provided countless suggestions to improve it, and who endured my chronic kvetching with grace and good humor. Our moderator for today's event is Dr. Harriet E. Wims, a Maryland licensed clinical psychologist. She is currently a clinical assistant professor of psychology at Loyola University, Maryland, and is also the founder and clinical director of the Village Family Support Center of Baltimore. Dr. Wims is a rising Kohenet, completing her training at the Hebrew Priestess Institute, an institute for the training of Jewish women in ritual and prayer. She is chair of the Ritual Committee and a member of the board of Hinenu, Baltimore Justice Stiebel, and the founder of the Baltimore Jews of Color community, Havruta. Harriet, take it away.
Thank you so much, Abe. I'm a little verklempt. And I also have the great honor of introducing Ms. Gina Green. Gina Green is a political strategist, writer, and consultant, and until June 2020, the Chief Strategy Officer at Bend the Arc Jewish Action. There, she led the work of the Communications Advocacy, Electoral, Rapid Response, and Racial Equity teams from 2018 to 2020, a period of unprecedented white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism in American life. Prior to Bend the Arc, Gina was managing director of the Democracy Collaborative at Rethink Media, where she strengthened the communications capacity of groups working on money and politics, fair and diverse courts, and voting rights. Gina is a frequent speaker and writer on democracy, leadership, race, racism in the Jewish community, and race community diversity, and it's been published in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, Salon, and more. A 2020-2021 fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, Gina sits on the boards of the Women's March, Political Research Associates, the Jews of Color Initiative, and Bend the Arc, a Jewish Partnership for Justice, an alum of the Jeremiah Fellowship and the Sela Leadership Programs, and a 2019 Studerman Fellow. Gina is a native Southerner. My mom came from Valdosta, Georgia, so you know I'm with you on that, and is the mother of 4 amazing kids. Without any further ado, thank you, Ms. Green.
Thank you so much, Harriet. Thank you, Abe. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you to Hisacamona. Thank you to the Jewish Museum. Thank you to the Reginald Lewis Museum for convening this conversation today. I am really delighted and feel just as honored as Harriet to be able to be in conversation with her today at no righter time than now to have the conversation that we're about to have. So I'm really delighted to be able to have this time with y'all, and thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to speak for a little bit, like right at you, and then Harry and I are going to start talking, which is probably going to be way more interesting than this frontal time that I'm going to give you, but it's a good setup for what's going to be a really great conversation. As Harriet mentioned, I do a lot of speaking. I do some writing, but I've been doing a lot of speaking over this last year, and the last 2 years, actually, as we have seen anti-Semitism and white nationalism and racism really rear their heads in ways that many of us had not seen before. But many of us had seen it before in the American community and in the Jewish community, which made an experience that I had last winter all the more telling and also all the more expected. I was on a panel with a couple of other leaders in the Jewish community and a couple of other Jews of color at an event sponsored by B'nai Jeshurun, a synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And we had a great conversation that got a little heated at points, deep at points, and then it got deeper at the very end. There was a little 5-year-old Black girl in the audience who got to ask the last question of the night. And her question really punctuated the evening's conversation like an arrow to the heart. Why is it, she asked, that Black people always live in places that are dangerous? And everyone on the panel turned in my direction. And then our moderator, our fearless moderator, whom I adore, directed the question to me. And as Harriet mentioned, I'm a communicator, communication strategist. That's what I help people do. That's what I do. And now my skills as a communicator were about to be, heretofore I'd been focused on persuading voters and elected officials. And now my skills were going to be put to the test by someone who couldn't even tie their own shoes. And how was I supposed to be able to explain systemic racism and perennial inequality to a kindergartner in fewer than 60 seconds, no less? We're at the end of the night, right? People are ready to go home. And her very asking of the question to me underscored the deep impacts of racism that have been purposely built into the system of America. Even a 5-year-old can see that Black lives are lived differently and matter differently. What she cannot see at 5 years old, and to be sure many adults fall into the same category as well, is that this disparity is the result of hundreds of years of systemic racism, and a racism that's not only about lynchings and the Ku Klux Klan, but is also about voting and redlining, education, and jobs. So, in all honesty, I really don't remember my precise answer. My heart was beating so loud in my chest and in my ears that I don't even think I can really remember what I had to say. But I think what we know, the general answer to this question, which is that Black people often live in places that are dangerous because we always have. And the flip side is also true, that Black people living in places aren't inherently more dangerous than any other place. Both of those are true. There's a story that we tell ourselves about Black communities and Black neighborhoods that comports with the racism that's built into the system. And it is true that our communities have been starved of resources, mismanaged and mistreated. And so in many cases, they can feel like they're dangerous. But the reality is that those places have existed since we got here. Those of us who came to this country through the transatlantic slave trade, we started from a place that was dangerous. We came to a place that was perhaps more dangerous, and it hasn't really gotten that much less dangerous over time. It's just dangerous in different ways. And the murders, for example, in 2020 and prior, beginning, well, actually they've never stopped, but the murders of Black people in their homes, in their cars, in their neighborhoods, by the very people sworn to protect and serve, has really galvanized a movement and a moment, and demonstrated, I think, in ways, like I said earlier, many of us weren't familiar with, how unsafe it is to be Black in America. There's a teaching from Rabbi Tova Spitzer, which was relayed to me by Rabbi Elise Wechterman about a year ago, that to me captures the severity of racial injustice in America. I'm going to read a little bit from the Torah, and we'll talk about it for a second. Here's a quote. If in the land you are coming to possess, there is found someone slain, lying in the field, and the identity of the slayer is not known, your elders and your officials shall come out and measure the distance from the corpse to the nearby towns. Rabbi Spitzer goes on to say that this scenario describes a situation when a murder has occurred, but it is impossible to know who actually committed the crime. Without a proper retribution, there is a blood guilt that cannot be absolved, which will endanger the entire society. In place of proper justice done to the perpetrator, she says, the leaders of the nearest city must undertake a blood ritual, thereby removing the blood guilt. And when a crime has occurred that involves the death of a human being, the land itself and those living in it become polluted. Even if the people directly responsible for the crime cannot be found, that guilt must be dealt with. The pollution must be cleaned up, or all the inhabitants of the land will suffer. She finishes up this teaching, until we as Americans do a proper tshuva for the double sins of slavery and the annihilation of Native Americans, we will continue to suffer profoundly as a society. The Torah says we have to come outside and look. We have to measure our own distance to the crime. We have to say, I might be accountable in some way for this atrocity. And to me, Rabbi Spitzer's teaching underscores that combating the systemic racism that has plagued the United States since our very founding, and really even saying plagued is not an apt metaphor because it suggests that it's just going to happen and all we can do is treat it, but actually we can prevent it and we can build a different country. And as Jews, I believe that we speak with a moral clarity and a prophetic voice that is uniquely situated to this moment. And this moment, to me, means addressing this challenge in two distinct ways. We must look at how we combat racial inequity and racial injustice outside the Jewish community in greater society, as well as inside the Jewish community, especially with and for Jews of color, particularly Black Jews. What are the questions that we must ask ourselves and the steps that we must take to combat this interpersonal and structural racism that in many ways feels like it's almost built into our DNA? That said, it's not anyone's fault, right? At this point in time, that racism and white supremacy show up relentlessly in our everyday lives. They both have been sort of hardwired into who we are and are in the water, so to speak, from the 3/5 clause in the US Constitution, which stated that enslaved Black people were 3/5 of a person, to the Supreme Court decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the concept of separate but equal, to voter purges and disenfranchisement meant to keep Black Americans from exercising their right to vote. And importantly, all those examples, they don't say anything about health policy, which we have seen in stark relief in the era of COVID and the pandemic. They don't say anything about transportation policy. They don't talk about environmental policy, criminal justice policy, lending policy, or education, all of the other myriad ways where the system has been stacked against Black people and further by extension, other people of color, and shapes our everyday lives. Systemic racism isn't only systemic, its ever-present nature also means that informs interpersonal racism between Black people, white people, people of color, non-white folks, in our interactions with others. And many of us, Black people included, have internalized ways of seeing Black people and Black life through a lens that has been clouded by a system that treats Black people as less than. And in that, I would say, if people are looking for material to consume that really underscores that notion that we produce racist ideas to sort of shape our policies and provide the rationale and explanation for them, Ibram Kendi's book Before How to Be an Anti-Racist was a definitive tome on racist ideas. And so for me, that has been such a tremendous book in outlining from the 1600s to now, how we understand race and racism and its justification and application in American life. Truly a phenomenal book. But as Jewish leaders at a time that we have as a Jewish community, both unprecedented privilege, though to be sure, rising anti-Semitism is threatening that, and a national moral crisis, what are we doing in this moment to bring about that change in our wider society? With whom are we partnering as a Jewish community? From whom are we learning as a Jewish community? I would argue that as a community, in recent years, many of us may have shied away from being too political. And I would argue at the same time that our current situation is actually less about politics and more about morality and our moral crisis and our moral imperative. and becoming more political in this moment may be how we approach this moment of moral crisis. Are we supporting organizations that are actively working to end police violence, to protect voting rights and clean up the water in Flint? Are we inviting dialogue with leaders in Black and Brown communities who may or may not also be Jewish and actively seeking to understand and to learn? Are we using our power as a Jewish community, our resources as a Jewish community, and our influence as a Jewish community to follow the leadership and invest in Black-led organizations who've been fighting this fight for decades already? Per the Torah and Rabbi Spitzer, how are we coming outside to look at the damage that has been done? And what are we doing when we have measured the distance from ourselves to the crime and realize that we are still committing it? In addition to our work righting the wrongs of our society, we must also look inward to our own community. How are we shaping our Jewish community to look and be? It is well known that being a Jew of color amidst largely white American Jewry is a perennial challenge. But Jews of color have long documented this exclusion, the humiliation, the interrogations that have pushed many of us to the periphery of mainstream Jewish life and engagement. As Jewish leaders, we can take a fresh look at what it means to build and reflect the multiracial Jewish community that we already know exists. What are we doing in our synagogues and institutions to welcome and invest in Jews of color? What program are we offering? Are they in the room, not when we're deciding what programs we're going to run, but are they in the room when we're making decisions about the budget? Are they in the room when we're making decisions about staff and leadership? How are we making day schools and synagogue membership more accessible to Jews of color and all Jews who don't meet a class ceiling or floor for us in the work that we're doing in serving our broader community? Organizations like UJA Federation in New York, the Cutler Jewish Day School, Urban Adamah, IKAR are all organizations and synagogues that I think are doing tremendous work in their communities to move toward full inclusiveness and multiracialness and really embracing who we are. There's a lot to learn and much to teach, but it really starts with asking the right questions and being willing to grapple with sometimes uncomfortable answers. Earlier, I noted that it's not our fault that racism and white supremacy show up relentlessly in our everyday lives, but it is our fault if and when we don't redress these wrongs and build the country that we know we can be, right? If we know there's a problem and we fail to act, then that's when we gain fault, if you will, is knowing and not doing. But why the work that we must do to create a society where we all belong is so critical is really reflected in one of my favorite midrashim that I'm going to close out with, and then we'll hop to some questions, Harriet, from the Yalkut Shimoni. He wrote, God gathered the dust of the first human from four corners of the world, red, black, white, and green. Red is the blood, black is the innards, and green for the body. Why from the four corners of the earth? So that if one person comes from the east to the west and arrives at the end of his life, as he nears departing from this world, it will not be said to him, this land is not the dust of your body, go back to where you were created. Rather, every place that a person walks, from there she was created, and to there she will return. In service of creating the world that is safe for all of us, where we can all go wherever we are and be wherever we are and leave this world wherever we are, it is imperative that we are not satisfied with simply being not racist. We must actively be anti-racist. It is hard, daily, and long-term work to rewire that national DNA and the DNA of ourselves and our communities. But in fact, we know, that is how biology works, and that is how evolution works. And there are leaps that we make, and there are moments in time when they're possible. And this feels like a rich and right moment for some transformational change for the world, for the United States, and for our Jewish community. Like that little Black girl at B'nai Jeshurun, we got to ask the right questions. They're going to be hard, and we have to ask them of the right people right now. And tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. We're really at an American flashpoint where I believe 400 years of systemic racism. There's a reckoning about that that's before us, both outside our Jewish community and within. And what we do next will determine our collective future for the Jewish community, for the Black community, and especially for those of us who live in both. The oft-quoted words of Rabbi Tarfon are particularly resonant in this moment. It is not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either.
Gina, thank you. Your words for me personally, as a Black Jew, are powerful, feel familiar, are painful and heavy, and also fill me with a desire to keep moving forward. So thank you for that. And I'm hoping that those who are helping us on the tech side can also drop in the chat the book that Ms. Green suggested, because I'm sure that there are a lot of folks who are tuned in who do want to continue to do the work and the reading and the questioning. So I'm going to start with a question. I will say, in almost every space, every Jewish space, every congregation, every place where I've gone, when I see other Black folks, they're usually the janitors. And it's hard to always be the voice, especially when you're a Black leader and you're trying to manifest change in Jewish institutions. You don't want to go in and, like, you know, throw up the dust. So my first question for you is a larger one, which is, how can Jewish institutions starting today create racial justice and be anti-racist in their day-to-day practices, from the moment someone turns the key to open until they close it to close in the evening?
Whew. That's such a good question. And it feels like the answer is going to be different for different institutions, right? I think that what I know from working with so many different Jewish institutions over these last several months is that different places and spaces are at different places on their own racial equity journey.
Yes.
I think one of the first steps that a Jewish communal institution can take is to recognize, like, that they are on a journey, whether they know it or not. If they haven't started, they're at the beginning, they're at start, right? And if they are in the middle and have applied, a racial equity lens to their work, they've begun to put justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in their budgets. They've started putting resources toward it. They have worked to bring Jews of color into decision-making leadership positions. They have worked to create operational space that respects the culture of a diverse staff, that makes space for everyone to bring their full and complete selves to work. Those are, all along the spectrum, right? There's that first step where you can just be like, hey, what are the things that we need to do, right, to be an anti-racist space? So right, asking that question is the first thing that they can do. Looking at who's in the room, who's on the list, what's in the budget, asking some of those questions. Mm-hmm. And then I think part of that is, okay, so here's where we are. What don't we know? What are the gaps in our own vocabulary, in our own learning, in our own political analysis that we need to shore up or to deliver a foundation for, that will allow us to navigate and chart a course of being on this racial equity journey? Some places may need to do a lot of work on staffing and leadership development and workplace culture. Other organizations may need to look at their budget and realize, oh, we haven't calculated or made arrangements to pay for X, Y, and Z for the Jewish community for our programming. Or they need to look at who's on the programming committee. It's hard to make diverse programming and offerings for the community if everyone who is in that room deciding looks the same or has had the
Mhm.
same background or has been doing the same thing for 20 years. So there's lots of different things I think people can do. And I think particularly for non-Jews of color, like for white Jews, I think also relying on each other for this teaching and this education is going to be big, right? I mean, just to be straight up, for most Black people in this country, unpaid labor is not, it's not a good look. And it's good
Yes.
to recognize that there is a cost and a price to being the teachers all the time, both teaching in our everyday lived experience when someone says X, Y, or Z, and sometimes in teaching in more formal ways such as this. And we get to do it and have a good time at the same
Right.
time.
Right.
And we're doing it in respectful space, but sometimes it's hard for
Yes.
JOCs to be that. And I think recognizing that is really important too.
And you just used the term JOCs. When you talk about Jews of color, I wonder, some folks who might be tuning in wonder what that term means.
Yeah. So I use it as a pan-ethnic term to describe Jews who are not of white, usually Ashkenazi sort of parentage, lineage, and
Right.
ancestry, to describe folks who have a decidedly different experience, particularly in the American Jewish community, because they don't look white, don't present as white, and have in fact backgrounds that are Black, Latinx, Indigenous. Can some Sephardim and Mizrahi Jews put themselves in that category. Some Arab and other Middle Eastern Jews put themselves in that category. But really, it's for folks to self-identify as being part of this sort of pan-ethnicity within the Jewish community that
Right.
experiences race and racism in a different way because of how we show up in ethnically and within our other communities.
Great. Thank you so much. And Asian Jews as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right. Thank you. So here's another question, and I've had a number of white-skinned Jews come to me and ask this question with true pain. They say, "Okay, I get it. I get that there's been some stuff that's happened that is not okay, but now I don't even know what to say. Like, I don't know, am I supposed to talk to you if you're at shul? Am I supposed to leave you alone? What am I supposed to do to make it better?" What would you say to those folks who are trying personally to make a change and are feeling stuck in loss?
No people are a monolith, and no subgroup of people are a monolith either. And I think that if you ask a million of Black Jews that question, you're going to get 1.5 million of answers in terms of what to do and what to say. Some folks are more comfortable than others asking certain questions. I'll tell you from my perspective, number one rule to me is don't make any assumptions except for one, which is that I'm Jewish. That is a safe assumption to make. If you see me in shul with a siddur, or you see my kids with tzitzit and kippot, that's the assumption you can make. Leave all other assumptions at the door. And I think one really tough part about this dynamic that you just mentioned, Harriet, is that we as a Jewish community have a biblical obsession, and not wrongly or rightly, but nearly an obsession with identity and who's who, right? Where'd you come from? What's your lineage? Who was your father? What's your tribe? And then, there's lots of who are you and who are we wrapped up in that. And so I recognize at the same time that there are many Jews, many white Jews there's a genuine curiosity, not necessarily an assumption, but meeting Jews of color for many white Jews doesn't comport with their own lived experience and with their own sort of Jewish mythology, right? About who we are and where we come from and what we really are. But we've always been a multiracial, multi-ethnic people since before we became Jews, right? And so I think it's really important to recognize, but your curiosity is never worth more than someone else's discomfort. And so I go back to that assumption. If you want to make an assumption, assume that I'm Jewish and let's just talk, right? Talk to me as if, don't talk to me just out of curiosity
Right.
about how I got there or why I'm there or what my path was, because that question, even though within typical white Jewish spaces may not be a disruptive or alienating experience, for Jews of color who get asked that question as a means of policing our presence, it's a different story. So that's what I would say. And then I would say, another thing that, that I think is really important is thinking about when you're in Jewish community spaces, what is the role that you can play in your committee meeting, in your board meeting, in your governance meeting, and this program meeting? Like, when can you say, where are the Black Jews? Where are the other JOCs? Depending on your community, where is the diversity? And I'll also just put we're talking about race and racism within the Jewish community, but I'm just going to say that I feel like beating racism in the United States is actually how we bring about liberation for everybody. And so becoming pro-LGBTQ comes with being anti-racist. Defeating anti-Semitism comes with becoming anti-racist. And all of these are wrapped up in an America like ours, getting at that root cause of the racism that we built all other oppressions on and around is really, really important.
Absolutely. I just looked up at the screen to make sure that we were recording because I wanted to start feverishly writing down what you were saying. So grateful that we are recording this and what you have just pointed out here. It's just so very salient. And I have another question for you, which is related to that. I'll go back a second. When I talk to Jews of color, we all have, most of us have that story of being asked why you're here. Where can I find the bathroom? Are you so-and-so's nurse? And just this weekend, I was literally making challah in my kitchen. And I thought to myself, all of those times when that happens, I've never said anything to anyone. It was the cost of being able to be Jewish. It was the cost of being able to be in a Jewish space. And I started to wonder, why in the world why was I quiet about that? What other costs do you think there are for systemic racism and inequality being part of Jewish spaces?
Well, I think your experience, that realization times the 15% of the American Jewish population that we estimate are Jews of color is the cost. Multiply that times the proportion of the Jewish community that we make up, and that's the cost. I feel like the cost is nothing less than the Jewish continuity that so many Jewish professionals and foundations wring their hands over year after year after year, right? How can we be concerned with Jewish continuity and not address the Jewish community that we have and that we are and not reflect it, right? That to me feels like the tremendous loss. The work that Ari Kelman did with the Jews of Color meta study last year, pinpointing exactly who we are, estimating some numbers. We actually don't know. We've got an estimate. Nobody's actually ever counted like an American census of the Jewish community where we actually count who we are. We just have estimates. And I think that, and our estimates are strong because, as we know, the Jewish community is following the same demographic trajectory as the American community writ large, right? We are going to be a mostly people of color country in less than 50 years. And we're going to be a largely Jews of color community also in less than 50 years. With each generation, we get more and more diverse. And if we're concerned, if we're truly concerned about what Jewish continuity looks like, then we need to look at the community we're going to be.
Right. And find ways to continue to embrace that community, right?
Exactly.
And I think that leads to a question of what are your thoughts about or thoughts of supporting multiracial Jewish families? And that also is sometimes means multi-spiritual,
Yeah.
multiracial families. What could the institutions do to support our families in that way?
I think that's such a tremendous question because, I mean, there are so many of our communities are multi-faith. So many of our households are multi-faith, right? Multiracial and multi-ethnic at this point. And I think any institution in the community that is working to serve and reflect has to be making sure that those folks who are the intended consumers of content, resources, programming, and investment are at the decision-making table and are part of that process from the beginning. It's really, really hard to deliver programming, investment, and resources that meet the needs of a community if you don't understand the community and you don't understand what is needed and you don't understand why there has been distance and they've been on the periphery, right? Like, I think this is a long-term proposition. In many cases, we're not going to go out, if you haven't already been engaging with Jews of color and you don't have any in your mix and you've got to go 2 and 3 degrees of separation, then you probably have a longer way to go on your racial equity, anti-racist journey than someone else, right? And so I think that you got to start with asking those questions of the right people at the right times. And that's always going to be one of the most important things you can do, recognizing that serving and investing and amplifying, lifting up can't come without relationship.
Yes. So I have one more question, and then we're going to open it up to our participants. And I really don't mean this. I'm not being flippant when I ask it. Someone recently described me as a Jewish leader, and I see you as a phenomenal Jewish leader. I am just trying to walk my talk and pray with my feet. And I'm tired. And I wonder, are you tired? And as you described our history, I started to understand the weight that's on my shoulders. And I just wonder, are you tired? And what could our allies and accomplices do to support us so we are not as fatigued?
I am really tired. I am tired as someone who's been doing racial justice work as a person and as both an avocation and a vocation. Like, this is really important to me. And I say it as the mom of 4 Black Jewish observant children, 2 of whom are boys who are biracial, who, I got 4 kids. I got 2 boys and 2 girls. My 2 boys, they look like Black boys. My 2 little girls don't really look like little Black girls. They look like little biracial girls. And it's different when you're a girl, but I've got these 2 Black boys who wear kippot and tzitzit that are not going to save them from anything, right? Like that, in an era of rising anti-Semitism, the kippah doesn't save the Black skin from anything, right?
Right.
And I think that in this era, we as Black people, Black Jews, and other targeted communities in this moment, we are just going to be tired. It is tiring. It is exhausting. And I think that accepting that is really important, and hating it and it being true. And my white allies, our white friends, I say, ask about a girl, give us a call, right? Like, I have a friend, and it may seem little, but there's like two pieces here. One is, what are you doing with your power, your influence, and your spheres of influence? What are you doing in that committee meeting, that board meeting, that those decision-making spaces? Who are you making sure is there? Who are you bringing up along with you? How are you thinking about making the pie bigger rather than talking about slices of it? How are we
Yes.
bringing everybody together? What does that look like? And then also getting some challah is not a bad thing. Sending some to your friends is not a bad thing, right? Like, thinking about us, giving us a call, giving us a text, like, there are personal things that I think show love and support and solidarity that aren't just, in the seeing if it's in the budget or seeing who the partner is. You can do interpersonal work too. And, I have a dear white friend, and I just say to her sometimes, I'm like, are you baking this week? And she says, yes, I am now, because you asked me to, and I'm okay with that. And I think that those types of gestures of love, of true love, are really important.
Thank you. You've brought me to tears.
Don't make me cry.
And just such deep, deep gratitude for you. And thank you for sharing your time and energy with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Guy-Decker to take questions from our participants.
Yeah, I'm gonna be the go-between between the participants' questions and the Q&A and the two of you. And just first, thank you to you both. Ms. Green, you really laid some real Torah on us today, and thank you. So there are a couple of questions here, and I'm gonna go not in the order they were asked, but sort of in relevance from this conversation about being tired. And you spoke to it a little bit, I think, when you talked about relationship, but if you could go a little deeper, I have a couple of questions actually that are all circling the same question, which, if I can rephrase, those of you who put this in the chat, the question at heart is, how do we as white Jews with power within Jewish institutions bring in Jews of color to the table, to the room where it happens, without tokenizing or objectifying? I think ultimately that's the question that's been asked here a couple of times.
Yeah. I think a few things. One is, I think the self-awareness goes a long way, right? The fact that there are folks asking this question of, how do I do this without it having a tokenizing effect? I think it's really important not to have there be a one and only, right? An only lonely, right? If you're thinking about diversifying your board, I think go through the work to make sure your board is ready to have JOCs in the mix, and is the culture, is the space right for them to be able to bring their full selves, their lived experiences, to the actual decision-making process. And I think it's also important to not just have the one. That's another piece, like having that, in many ways, a built-in affinity space for people who are, for JOCs, Black Jews who are coming into a new environment that might not be structured and built for them to be who they are in it. I think having essentially a cohort is really, really helpful. And obviously boards are different than staff, right? If you're trying to diversify your staff, that's a whole other kettle of fish in terms of how ready are you? What's your workplace culture like? That's a different kettle of fish, but in terms of, it's a little bit easier, I believe, with boards and volunteer and lay leadership to help bring them along in a way that creates a space where they can welcome Jews of color and Black Jews and not have it be tokenizing, and really be able to bring in the full breadth of their experience and expertise.
I think it's also important, reflecting back on Ms. Green's midrash, the midrash that you shared. I'm thinking, if you build it, then perhaps they will come. I'm going to even challenge the Jewish institutions that are or representatives from those institutions. Do you have Jews of color, Havruta? Have you had a conversation about that? When I was figuring out where to go and and how to be present in Jewish space, I'm going to look to see, is there something there ahead of time that's going to support me? And when I come into the shul at the same time, don't everyone come up to greet me? You know, like give
Yeah.
a sister a little bit of space. And
Exactly.
what was there before I walked in the door,
Right.
right?
Thank you.
Totally.
I'm going to remind our participants, you can put your questions in the Q&A if you are on the Zoom with us. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please put your questions into the comments section. We do have folks watching those comments to paste them into the Q&A so that I can see them. So I see sorry about my dog. I see a couple of other follow-ups as sort of a result of our conversation. So one of the questions is actually sort of personal. And so I'll invite you both to answer. And Ms. Green, if you want to answer first, the question is, if there are spaces that have made it feel like home, that have felt like home to you, what did those organizations do to create that space for you?
At the risk of sounding a little bit like an infomercial for Bend the Arc, I think Bend the Arc it is a national Jewish political organization that works in a lot of different arenas and local level organizing and national policy and advocacy and in leadership development. And I feel like what Bend the Arc has done and been committed to is being on this journey, is being on this path to being anti-racist and having explicit commitments over time, right? There hasn't been perfection, but I think the number one thing has been for years committing to getting better at creating spaces for a multiracial, multi-ethnic Jewish community to bring all of our talents into the workplace, into our staff, into our operations, and also into our board, which we're working on right now. So I feel like that acknowledgement and willingness and commitment to be on the path is like first things first. And then I think that when you actually get tactical, that a few things are important. One is having there be space for people of color, Jews of color within larger majority white institutions to be people of color and Jews of color in an affinity space. I think that is really tremendous because being a person of color in most majority white spaces is every day a task and every day its own little part-time job, just sort of showing up and existing and dealing with the microaggression. Like it's hard work that we do on top of the job. So that space I feel like is really, really important. Obviously, it's hard to do that if you don't have a critical mass or a number, at least a small, cohort of Jews or people of color in this space. I think also recognizing the various paths that people of color often take to the workplace and to jobs and what our experiences have been getting to X organization or Y organization is really important. And I think that comes into like, how does racial equity play into our human resources, which I think is a huge deal when we're talking about staffing. I think for volunteering, that willingness to be a place where people of color can bring their full selves is, again, still seems to be one of the top reasons and explanations for what makes a space a good space. And Harriet, I'm curious, you've led all over the place as well, if that comports with your own experience.
It does. And I'm even going to get a little bit personal to say that I want to hold up Rabbi Wexler at Hizkamunah, who embraced me and supported me in doing an adult bat mitzvah, in joining programming to support my leadership, and also thinking about Hinenu. And we are a DIY shul. And from the beginning, I was my desire to be a leader was encouraged, which has been beautiful. What I will also say to folks here in Baltimore is look around at your leadership organizations. Board of rabbis, are there people of color there? Organizations for Jewish leaders, are there people of color there? And folks who are working in Jewish schools, are you suggesting cantorial and rabbinical studies to your Jewish students of color? And asking, if you haven't,
That's great.
maybe
Yep.
asking yourself, how come? So that we can support our communities in that way too.
Harry, I just want to like underscore what you just said though, because I think that have you asked, right? Going back to this notion of the questions that we ask and who we're asking them. Have you asked? Have you thought to ask? You know, I saw a statistic the other day that said, and I don't know if this is true across racial difference or not, but it said that like the average 85% of white Americans don't have any non-white friends. 85% or something ridiculous. Y'all don't quote me on that. Maybe Google it. But it was wild. And so to your question of who are you talking to, it's going to take some time sometimes to find people to talk to and build that relationship and build that muscle so that they can come in and you can have someone you're asking, are you considering cantorial school?
I want to, so thank you. I'm just going to sort of paraphrase something that you're saying. This answers some additional questions that folks are putting in the chat, which, and also folks, we are like 2 minutes to when we're supposed to end. I think we'll go a couple minutes over, but we're probably not going to get to all of your questions. And I'm sorry for that, but that just accept and expect non-closure, right? But what I wanted to say about what you two are just saying, Ms. Green and Dr. Wims, is I want to say to all of us that, and I've said this before, you may have heard me say this before, relationship moves at the speed of trust, and so social change moves at the speed of relationship. And so your questions of how do we attract, it takes time and it takes real commitment and showing up and making space and relationship and trust. And so
Yes.
I just want to underscore that. So I have a couple of questions actually about the nomenclature that we're using. So I have at least one person in the chat who's sort of bristling at the word white, which I'm sure you all have heard before. I'm not white, I'm Jewish. This person didn't say that, but that's kind of the sentiment, that it's uncomfortable for some white-skinned Jews to sort of own whiteness. And is there a different word that we could use? And another person who points out the fact that of color can be somewhat problematic. This person is explicitly calling out Spanish-speaking Americans who maybe aren't feeling that pan-ethnic connection that Ms. Green, you spoke about when you defined Jews of color. So I wonder, I'll start with you, Ms. Green. Do you have any reactions to either of those, the use of those two words? I mean, I know as a fellow communications professional, like you work with what you got. Right. And do you have any reaction to those kind of flags that are being put up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, looking at Jews of color, JOCs as a term historically, right? It was, not that old, but the term like people of color, women of color as sort of a movement language is not that old either. We're talking about the 70s and 80s, right? And so I think that thinking about what was going on at that time, thinking about how, the 60s and 70s of the Black Power movement and like Black women and Black feminists like searching, and then also, but then having Indigenous women, Mexican American women who are like, we're with you in this fight. So I think there's like a solidarity sort of history that's important for people to understand why such a term would be appealing to people who've experienced mostly white Jewish community in many of the same ways, right? Like that's a recognition that when we show up in space, we get treated similarly by folks who are white skinned or not of color themselves. As far as, Spanish speaking Jews, I think listen, the Latino, Latinx, Latina designation is one that can be very complicated, right? Like there is there are white Latinas and who are Ashkenazi, but have like a cultural experience that is one that they feel like they're in the Jews of color sort of panorama, right? And I think that if you want to be in, you're in my book. If your experience might put you in a position where you're experiencing mostly white Jewish space in a way because of your own cultural or ethnic upbringing, come on in, is what I say. The question about white-skinnedness and I'm not white, I'm Jewish. There was a recent piece in the New York Times about this. Someone like wrote in and said, you know, as a Jewish person, I don't feel like I'm white. I don't want to check that box. I'm Jewish. And I just say, and my answer to that is fine for you to feel like on the inside, but the rest of the world doesn't see you as not white Jewish. You still look like a white person to them, which then therefore means that you get to benefit from that whiteness, whether or not you have accepted or readily take on the term. That everybody else is going to look at you as white. You're going to be treated as white, even if inside you don't feel like you are. And I think that's really, really important to look at in the context of America and Americana and what being white has meant. And we also know that whiteness can come and go. Sometimes people don't start out white, but then in a couple generations, they get to be in this country, right? And so it's not a mantle that people may want to carry, and yet it is a privilege that we're given if you're white in this country. And I think this question of, can I just uncheck it and then not be responsible for the privileges that I get because of something that I actually have the privilege of being able to decide whether or not I would want to check it or not, is not how it works in this country. And I'm sorry if that was probably a little bit blunt, but I just...
Blunt is good.
Yeah, Dr. Woods, do you have anything to add?
Not a single thing.
Okay, I would just, so for the folks asking that question, I would direct you actually to a 50-year-old essay by James Baldwin. Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white. And I think James Baldwin just was a gift to this world. But that essay in particular, I would direct you to. It's the terminology is different. Like the word Negro, even anti-Semitism is spelled differently now. But the sentiment really, really helps to underscore that fact that the choice of a white-skinned Jew to say, I'm not white, I'm Jewish, is not a choice that either of you two have to say, well, I'm not Black, I'm Jewish. You're not.
Right.
You don't get to say that. So I think that's an important point. So we're running out of time. So I'm actually going to close with, I have a question from someone who says, I'm new to Baltimore and I want to get connected and be involved with the Jews of color here. Where do we meet? Where do we worship? And what other platforms are we on? Dr. Wims, can you answer that question?
Please. There will be a Facebook link to our Baltimore Jews of Color Havruta that I'm building. Please go there. Please find me on Facebook. I email me. You'll find me if you Google me, and let's build mishpacha. Let's do it. You're already part of the family.
Thank you so much. I see that I also want to say that this is the first in a series. So I saw some questions about how many Jews of color are there, and other questions about, well, if Judaism were more just a religion and not an ethnicity, then wouldn't this be easier? Your questions will be answered. Come to the other sessions in the series. My colleagues are going to be putting in the chat the links. When you leave, you will be directed to a survey. Please take it. And that will also direct you to the registration link to the next in the series. And I'm just going to check my notes to make sure I don't forget to say anything that I was supposed to say right now. Yeah, register for the next program. And we are going to stick around for just a few minutes so that you can cut and paste the things out of the chat that you need. I want to apologize again if you put a question in the Q&A and we didn't get to you. I am sorry, but that is just the nature of this topic because as Ms. Green said when she started, there is no writer time for this conversation. So on behalf of the Jewish Museum of Maryland and Hizicamuno Congregation and the Lewis Museum, I want to thank you again, Dr. Wims and Ms. Green. It has been just really energizing. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time and doing the emotional labor that I know it took to do this. So thank you. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Tracy.